Greetings, greenhouse people. It is time for another episode of Tech on Demand brought to you by GrowerTalks magazine. If you don't receive GrowerTalks in green profit every month, head over to GrowerTalks.com and subscribe. We've been bringing news and information to the industry for more than 75 years, so if you're not a subscriber, it is about time. And speaking of subscribing, be sure to subscribe to the Tech on Demand podcast on your favorite app. Once you subscribe, you will never miss an episode. I'm your host, Bill Calkins, and this episode is about as important as they get because the topic is resistance management, and it's something every single grower needs to be concerned with, and it's 100% dependent on the choices you make each time you go to battle with pests and diseases. My guest this time is Dr. Janna Beckerman from Envu, and she has tons of experience with the issues of resistance and rotation strategies, and some very wise thoughts and words to share related to the topic. The ultimate goal here is true IPM that's sustainable for our industry. Before we start, here's a little bit about my guest. Janna Beckerman is an ornamentals technical specialist at Envu and part of their green services team. Prior to Envu, she worked at Purdue University and the University of Minnesota as a professor of plant pathology for almost 25 years. Janna continues to focus on developing environmentally sound pest management strategies that are economically feasible for growers and pest managers of specialty crops, and is now excited to also focus on insect and weed management. She's been a Tech on Demand guest twice before, conducted at least one webinar with Chris Beatties, and is also a contributor to GrowerTalks magazine. Janna is one of the best. But that's enough out of me. Let's get into it. Dr. Beckerman, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
And it really is great to have you back because you always do an awesome job making complex topics understandable and action-oriented. This is actually our third podcast together. Can you believe it?
Yes and no. So I have fun. I love doing these.
And so far, we've talked about pre-emergence herbicides and why products like Marengo can save greenhouse and nursery growers a ton of money and hassle. And then we talked foliar diseases, your ABCs of anthracnose, botrytis, and cercospora, and how product like Broadform as well as solid sanitation protocols go a long way to preventing nightmare scenarios if diseases get out of control. But today we are here to talk insect pests, and specifically, I guess, greenhouse pest management and the importance of rotation. And in the intro, I actually made the assertion that resistance management might be the most critical component to growing crops these days if we want to continue floriculture production in the future with access to a decent chemical and biological toolbox. You think I'm off base putting resistance management at the top of the list of focus for growers? Or is that a fair way to look at it?
Absolutely. And not just for insecticides, but for fungicides and for herbicides as well. It's foundational at this point. When I worked at Purdue, I actually did a paper that showed the progression of, or I guess you could say the regression of development in the case of fungicides, and that, the heyday was in the late 70s, early 80s when we had a lot of products going out, and the number of new AIs and products have been declining. And we were really fortunate, going back to fungicides, because whenever we had really bad resistance issues, we came up with a new mode of action. And the same has often held true for insecticides as well. But we're seeing it's longer and longer between new active ingredients, and even longer still when you're going to new classes of active ingredients. So I think it is absolutely, rotation along with sanitation are going to be foundational approaches to keeping our industry sustainable.
Yeah, and I love that you folded sanitation in because I think you can't have one discussion without the other, really. And pest and disease control or resistance management, like sanitation is such an important step in the process. And we talk a lot about breaking the green bridge between crops and really starting clean, staying clean. Like there's so many cliches, but they are all so true and so critical and can't be overlooked.
Absolutely. And it's really interesting how, we end up with these new products that allow us to regress. I was, digging in through the literature, and you can generally see about in the early 80s, people stopped talking about sanitation because they had such, that they had in the insect world, pyrethroids just came out in the fungal and the disease world, we had different DMIs, and the strobies were literally just down the pipeline there. And so I think because we had these really powerful AIs, we thought we didn't have to do that. And that's why we are in the position we're in now, where we have multiple resistances to multiple classes of insecticides, to fungicides, and even herbicides.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I will always continue to encourage our listeners to study up on resistance. Work closely with your suppliers and partners like Envu, because you'll find the right products and rotations to use. You will be able to control pests and diseases and weeds and everything you need to, but it does take some work. It does take attention to detail. And that's really the beauty of partnerships with suppliers who have strong technical teams. And so let's start digging into this topic, because
don't undersell yourself. I mean, you're a huge resource as well to, talk to growers, and also as an objective person to say, here are some really good products, here are some rotations, and here are things that I've seen that have worked for other people. And talking to your colleagues and your peers, one of the things I love about our industry is that we're really good at sharing information. We don't, just keep it all to ourselves and hoard it. And that's actually been like one of the best parts in being in this job is really getting to talk with all of the growers from, small companies to really large companies, and seeing what works best for them, and then taking those pieces and trying to come up with something that will improve the performance for everybody.
No, that's so true. I think just leveraging the range of expertise, and then, partnering with a megaphone like GrowerTalks to get the information out is one of the great things that our industry's had for decades and generations now. So I'm glad to see it continuing, and I'm glad you like it on this side of the industry. And I can always tell when we talk that you do have you like talking about these things, and you like the mystery and the challenge, and the fact that every day is probably different in your role on the technical team. So that's
always
really
learning, always
sure.
learning.
So we titled this podcast episode "Rotating from Resistance to Results." And I guess maybe we can start. Can you explain what resistance actually looks like in a greenhouse, and maybe some early warning signs growers should watch for? I mean, you talked about that evolution or de-evolution of the products that are available, and the effectiveness they have on the pests and diseases that we're trying to control, but maybe some early warning signs. And are there some greenhouse pests that are more likely or quick to develop resistance versus others?
Yes to everything. I guess one of the things I want to make sure before we start is talking about resistance is whenever there is a failure or a problem, I think all of us jump to the idea that the problem is resistance. And before we do that, I want to caution everyone to take a step or two back, because poor coverage and miscalibration has the exact same symptomology as resistance does. So you want to make sure that, the volume you thought you used was the actual volume that you used, and that you had really good coverage, and that coverage was with the right nozzles. When we're controlling fungal diseases, we want a really fine droplet size. But for insecticides, we want to make sure we're at medium, and weeds, we generally go medium to large droplet sizes. And if you're using the wrong nozzle, you're not going to get the kind of coverage you need to get the optimal control. And so that could actually look like resistance. The next is double checking your calibration. Mistakes happen. Everybody does it. Usually it involves dropping a decimal or two or sometimes three. I worked with grad students for a long time. I've made all of these mistakes myself. And I can honestly say the first thing I always would think of was resistance. I would have to say like 95 times out of 100, it was, a mistake. It was a user error on my part or on the part of my team. So making sure that your calibration is correct, making sure your coverage was good, and then also making sure your diagnosis is correct. I think of some of the examples I've gotten where oftentimes it's too late to make a diagnosis, but you'll get a blighted shoot and you'll think it might be due to like a borer or a twig girdler. And in fact, it's a canker pathogen, or it could even be a root rot. And then after you've done that diagnosis, even though we're supposed to be talking about insecticides here, but sometimes it turns out like that root rot, is it an oomycete, or is it a true fungus, or is it a canker or bacterial disease? And so I think we automatically jump to, it's easier to blame the product than yourself. Because you dropped the decimal point, you didn't cover things well, you were in a hurry and you had the wrong diagnosis. After you've ruled all of that out, that last part of it is, then I start to think, could we be looking at pesticide resistance issues? And they all share similarities. And regardless of what product you're talking about, that control for a specific pest that you've always had really good results with is less or even ineffective. And this process could be gradual, and that's more common that it's a gradual development, but it can be an absolute where one time an application works and the next time it doesn't. That's a less common type of resistance. We see that with thiophanate methyl, the active ingredient in Clarice 3336, where there's no stepwise involved. It's all or nothing. Most of the time with insecticides and with fungicides, we see a slow loss of efficacy. So what this means is using aphids. Things that you once easily controlled aren't succumbing to the same degree that you used to have with your pesticide. And we had multiple reports this year on a diversity of different insecticides. Thrips is another one that's always a big challenge. Those are probably the two biggies I think of on the insect side that I've been hearing a lot of issues with. On the fungal side, we're always dealing with botrytis and downy mildews. And, just I guess to be consistent talking about pesticides in general, we all know about Roundup resistance with mare's tail. Is probably the big example there. So all of this happens where you've had something that was really good at controlling it and you no longer are. And usually one of the underlying issues is that your sanitation, like what we were saying, isn't as good as it used to be. And these populations kind of built up. But resistance is rare. It absolutely happens because we're growing lots of plants. They have lots of pest problems and these populations can build up. And when you're not controlling it, you get these high levels that allows resistance to be selected for. And by that, what I mean is whenever you spray any sort of pesticide, you're obviously killing your target pest, but you're also selecting for whatever can survive. And so if you end up, only spraying a few hundred of your target pests because your sanitation is good, you're less likely to select for that resistance versus you waited until it was like the Armageddon of aphid infestation. And you have so many there that it's more likely. For some pests, the rate of mutation could be 1 in, I'm going to go back to fungi because I know that better, but the rate has actually been calculated and it's 1 in 1 quadrillion, which I think is 12 zeros.
A lot of zeros.
A lot of zeros.
Yeah.
Which sounds kind of crazy, but anybody who's ever looked at like a plant with botrytis, you're easily with, hundreds of millions in one plant. An outbreak like that isn't unheard of. And the same is true with aphids and thrips. We've all been in those greenhouses where it's just gotten out of control. The reason that sanitation is important is it knocks the numbers down. The reason that rotation is important is that if you selected for this, and remember, every time you spray a pesticide, you are selecting for this. You're going to have something that survives. And if you rotate and use a different mode of action, you'll kill it with something else so that population never builds up.
Okay, and that's a great segue to my next question, which is, what are some common rotation mistakes that you see that either speed up resistance or don't really address the concern as expected, I guess?
Yeah, so some of the common mistakes I see are people who think, and I see this regardless of what pests they are trying to control, they think they're doing a rotation because they've used products with different names. But it turns out that the active ingredient, even though the active ingredients can be different, they have the same mode of action. So this would be, using a rotation, for example, that included something like imidacloprid rotated with Safari. You have a back-to-back, rotated with TriStar. You have, 3 neonics there. Even though you've used 3 different products, they're all functioning the same way. And I always, joke about this, like the Three Stooges, big Three Stooges fan. My dad and I used to watch them all the time. Yeah. And, it would be like, when they go and poke you in the eye and eventually, Mo would put his hand up to block the eye poke, and if you just keep poking, you're going to figure out how to block the eye poke. But, if you poke someone in the eye and then elbow them in the gut and kick them in the shin, those are 3 different ways. Those are 3 different modes of action. So you can absolutely, if using neonics is in your wheelhouse, use one of those neonics, but then rotate to another product with a different mode of action. The nice thing about our Envu portfolio with insecticides is we have so many different modes of action. And I like to think of it as kind of an easy button because we have a core that you can supplement in and rotate around products that you already like, but providing you automatically with at least 3 and soon to be 4 different modes of action. Oh, we actually still already have 4 different modes of action. Can't even keep track anymore.
All right, I'm going to ask what may be a really dumb question, but if I have it, someone else is going to have this question. Mode of action is a term I've heard a million times, but I do not have a horticulture degree or any sort of degree in this science. Can you explain what mode of action is?
Yeah, so mode of action is the description as to how a product, and this goes across all the chemistries, actually targets the cellular mechanism.
Okay.
So going back to the neonics, for example, since we're trying to stick with insecticides. And so all of those products target the same receptor in the cell. And that would be one mode of action. Another mode of action is targeting a different receptor, like the ryanidine receptor, or targeting a calcium channel blocker. These are all different biochemical pathways that a cell needs to survive. And by blocking that pathway with and in this case, an insecticide, the cell cannot complete its process. And it could end up just slowing it in the case of maybe preventing molting. It could inhibit lipid synthesis, so the cell membranes don't perform optimally. It could prevent neurotransmitters in the case of the neonics and the ryanidine, so that the insect can't complete its life cycle.
Okay. So it's like the mode of the action on the targeted pest.
Yes.
Okay.
A much more succinct way of describing it.
No, because in my head I was like, well, is it the action of it moving through the plant, but it's the action upon the pest or disease, whatever that you're going after.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So, think of it as, some modes of action, like we're trying to kill things. So I'm going to use a violent metaphor here. Some modes of action are going to be guns, knives. All of these are poisons, but, they're just killing the insect or preventing its growth or preventing its egg laying ability in a different way.
Okay.
So those are the different modes of action.
Okay. No, that makes sense. And that clears it up. And now I can sort of, when I hear that term, I'll have a better understanding of it. And I know that term's used quite a bit, especially when you're looking at the different charts, the frag charts and the IRAC charts, and looking at rotation charts. They always talk about mode of action and active ingredient, but it's really the mode of action that you're looking for when it comes to resistance.
When we're doing our rotations, yes, but other things to keep in mind, you had mentioned, does it move in the plant or does that address it? And to me, I think of that as mobility. And, some pesticides will just stay on the surface of the plant. That's a contact. And sometimes just by contacting the insect, it will kill it. Others need to be ingested. So in the process of feeding on the plant, it will kill it. Some products are systemic, which means they translocate throughout the plant. And we break that down even further because sometimes it will be translaminar. So it will go from one part of the leaf to the underside of the leaf. But then that could also require that it be ingested or it could be contact that way. Okay. And one of the things I learned early on is more often than not, the more scientists explain things, the less anyone understands. And I've probably hit that point right now.
No, actually, the way that you described it makes complete sense to me, and I do appreciate that. All right, so you mentioned neonics, and we're talking a little bit about those products, and what we really want to talk about here is sort of a sustainable rotation. So assuming that growers want to reduce the reliance on neonics and some harder, I guess, in quotes, traditional chemistries, or they've been told to do that by the retailers they're supplying in some cases, but they still obviously need strong control of these insect pests. So like, what does a softer, and I'm putting those terms in quotes because I don't even know if they're accurate or scientifically accurate, but I know that growers use those terms and suppliers sometimes as well. I hear those terms a lot. So what does like a softer insect control rotation look like in practice, and what would make it sustainable but also effective?
Yeah. So, all of those are such loaded terms. I feel like you're tiptoeing amongst the landmines there. And they're also they're kind of weasel words, in a way.
Oh, for sure.
So I guess I want to be really clear that, neonics absolutely have a place and that they, the judicious use of neonics absolutely have a role in rotation, but in some places, unfortunately, public sentiment has overridden logic. Why should our world be any different than the rest of the world at large? And So these are some of the constraints that we have to deal with. So when we look at that, and this is where it's really unfortunate with the branding of the neonics, and I'm not telling anybody anything they don't already know, that in many ways, these were a lot softer than, your pyrethroids, your carbamates, and your organophosphates. So everyone was super excited about these early on because it had a softer profile. Now so I do think there's this kind of moving the goalposts that unfortunately we haven't had a very good discussion with the broader public to clarify these things. But when I think of trying to come up with, softer quote unquote rotations and things like that, my goal is to always try and keep things within the realm of IPM, and true IPM. And that's what I'm always shooting for. Involves sanitation, like we discussed. That is a cornerstone. It does involve the judicious use of chemistries, and you only go as toxic as you need to go. And it also incorporates, biological control agents and natural enemies. I think all of us, learned in kindergarten, along with, not running with scissors, is you don't kill your friends. It's just, and we have, the insect world is just so absolutely amazing. And, I want to make sure that that world is there for our children and for their children and things like that. And so taking a nuclear approach to your pest problems isn't only short-sighted, but it isn't sustainable. And we see that with resistance. And we see that with, some of the legislative issues. So by relying on an integrated approach, we have a more sustainable outcome. We can minimize the use of neonics. They might be a tool for certain instances. There's some pests that a number of growers need to use neonics for or rely upon them. Mealybugs is often one of those such pests. But that said, our reliance on them, just like carbamates and organophosphates, there's a lot of resistance.
Right.
I was just out in California, and they're using imidacloprid like nobody's business for glassy-winged sharpshooter. There's already been a lot of resistance to neonics with glassy-winged sharpshooter. So making sure we do things in a rotation is the best way of avoiding this resistance and making it sustainable. There are so looking for that B box, which is really important, but also reading the fine print, because there are a number of labels that it doesn't have a B box, because the B box has unfortunately become a scarlet letter in our world and not what it was meant to be, and that was to protect pollinators. So read the fine print on your labels. I really think I understand, as somebody who reads labels a lot and constantly reading and learning new things, or thinking I knew a label and suddenly like, oh, wait a second, this actually has some weasel words here.
Yeah.
That I wasn't quite picking up on. So keeping an eye on that is really important. And I think I lost the thread there.
No, you didn't, because that was exactly what I was asking, was what does a sustainable rotation or sustainable program look like? And you said it straight up. It's IPM. It's using IPM is foundational, right? You said you start with the sanitation. There are chemistries, use them as safely as possible. The nuclear approach is not good. And then the biocontrols. And I love that analogy of, we don't want to kill our friends. Like the biocontrols that are being used by growers from small to large have become such a huge part of their IPM program. And they're working with the, more traditional chemistries that actually work and don't impact those biologicals. And it's all working together to end up with healthy crops that you send to market. And I think more and more that's how growers are thinking these days. It's that holistic look. It's that comprehensive IPM strategy that they want. And it makes sense to me. I think that's the right way to grow.
I think this is why we get along so well. We're on the same page.
Let's discuss some specific products and start kind of an effective rotation. So let's start with what pests we're trying to prevent or control. And I think we're going to start with the product Altus. So why are we starting with Altus? What are we trying to control? Let's build a rotation program.
Yeah. So Altus is a unique chemistry. We're really proud of it. It can be applied as a foliar application, and it can be applied as a drench. So it gives you the flexibility. It has a unique mode of action. It's a butanoid chemistry. but it acts like it's a neonic, but it isn't a neonic. As a result, it doesn't tend to aggregate in flowers, making it safer for pollinators and a lot of biological control agents and natural enemies. So I like to lead with Altus, particularly when we are trying to control aphids. Recently did a trial looking to control cotton melon aphid, and Altus just hands down across the board, whether it was a foliar application or a drench application, knocked them out of the park. It provides a lot of, foliar applications, at least 2 weeks of control. The drench application, we were doing it like every 4 weeks, but earlier studies showed that you can get 6 to 7 weeks of control with a drench. And so it's absolutely a fantastic product to start. But remember I said that, this is a D-IRAC group, so that's our mode of action.
Okay.
We want to mix things up. So one of the next products that I like to recommend is Contos. And Contos is another unique mode of action. It's an IRAC code 23. It ends up interfering with the lipid biosynthesis of the insect. So it messes up the cell membrane so they can't continue to grow. It is far more toxic to early nymph larval stages, because those are the ones that are growing, than to adults.
Okay.
And it does take a little bit of time to kick in, because again, you need to have that growing to stop them from growing. It can be applied also as a foliar or a drench, but excellent control for not just aphids. Both Altus and Contos are foundational for the control of aphids, for the control of whiteflies, for the control of nymph larvae or thrips, nymph, and also mealybugs, which are considered really, really challenging, but they control. And then last but not least, within the Envu portfolio is Aria. And we acquired Aria when we merged with FMC's Specialty Crops Division. This is another different mode of action. This is an IRAC 20. It ends up targeting, I believe it is the rhyodine receptor. And so it ends up messing up the mortar control and the feeding. It works really quickly. It could also be applied as a foliar application or a drench. And those three together, I think of them as like a foundational easy button if you're trying to control any sort of piercing sucking pests. Because right there, we're not giving you one solution. We're giving you a rotation of 3 products to start managing. And I want to stress 3 products is not enough.
Right.
Particularly with something like aphids, where, I will never get over the fact that, an aphid could give live birth to its pregnant daughter. So to me, that just freaks me out. It gives birth to...
Say that again?
An aphid can give live birth to its pregnant daughter. So the daughter at birth is already gravid with with its grandchildren. When you're talking, I know, it's just biology is crazy. So when you think about the risk of resistance there and why it can get established so quickly in the aphid population throughout the industry, I think all of us have said that you really want to use at least 4 modes of action. I generally, if somebody tells me we need 4 modes of action, I try to offer up 5 or 6. So some other really good players to consider would be, Ventigra from BASF, which is a different mode of action. That's IRAC code 9D, or Rycar, which is a B, but you have, again, different modes of action. And these guys target the cordontal organ. That's what they target. And then last but not least would be, I know a lot of growers use mainspring. This is an IRAC 28. So this is a diamide chemistry, and this also can be used for aphids. This one, all of these have the risk of being overused. What I like about Altus, Contos, and Aria is you can apply them as a foliar or as a drench. The same is true for mainspring. Antigra or Rycar, those need to be used as foliar applications only. But again, when I'm being asked how to apply this, I know a lot of growers like drenches, particularly for hanging baskets. That's a no-brainer. But I always, try to encourage growers, going back to the sustainability, is put your product where your pest is. If you have something infecting the foliage, put it on the foliage. You will always get better results than if you drench it and wait for it to translocate throughout the plant. And actually, we have some trial data to show that is in fact the case.
And you're right. I do hear that a lot is, at least 4, but 5 or 6 is even better.
Yes.
And I think that, no, thank you for adding to those three, because I think growers will definitely appreciate that. So one of the things that I read about, so we'll just talk a little bit about ARIA. One of the things I read about ARIA, and I think it was in your guys' literature, is that you called it a resistance busting partner with no known cross resistance. So what does that mean, I guess, in terms of like a grower making decisions in a greenhouse? What is that phrase like? How is that a benefit? I mean, it makes sense, I guess, logically, but
So it's a unique mode of action. There is
okay.
no other product on the market that is an IRAC 29 as of this point. When you look at something I had suggested, Ventigra or Rycard,
Yeah.
they are different. They're both nines. There's subtle differences. Just like with Altus versus the other neonics, there are differences. But Aria it's in a class by itself. When you look at Mainspring, it's got the same mode of action as Durentis. So you could be if you were using Mainspring, for example, to treat your petunias, you don't want to come back and alto, for aphids, you don't want to come back and double dip. You shouldn't need to come back and double dip with something like Durentis because you should be getting the control. But again, making sure you're being careful with your rotation so that you aren't, I don't know what else to call it other than double dipping, which is hitting the same mode of action over and over. And keep in mind, a lot of times when we're seeing these resistance issues, what I've noticed is that all of these issues happen with growers who are oftentimes by nearby agricultural fields.
Mm-hmm.
And so these pests are coming in the fall after harvest, and the growers for these food crops have fewer modes of action, and they're repeating them over and over. So that's, I think, where some of this resistance is coming in.
So when you talked about Contos as a key part of this rotation, this 3-product rotation from Envu, can you talk a little bit about how the product works and why its mode of action matters, specifically for pests hiding in the plant tissue or other kind of hard to reach spots? You talked about the movement of products through the plant, but tell me a little bit more about Contos and how that works.
Contos is unique for a diversity of reasons. It is one of the only amphimobile insecticides, and that means it is xylem mobile, is phloem mobile, and it is translaminar, which means it literally can just move all throughout the plant, which is really good for killing anything that can get into the buds or those hard to reach places where your coverage is always an issue. This is really important with some of our thrips larvae that can get into buds. I mean, thrips are just such a pain because they spend so much of their life cycle in these cryptic places. They're hiding in buds. They're hiding, they're ovipositing in leaf tissue. They're pupating in the soil. And, obviously Contos isn't going to do anything for what's going on with the pupa, but it will help with the larvae in the buds and those hard to reach places there.
Okay. No, that makes sense. That's really unique. I think that's cool. So I guess as we close, if a grower wants to start to implement this Altius, Contos, Aria rotation tomorrow, or, with their next crop, it sounds like it could be something for poinsettias. What is like a simple framework for success, and how do growers decide whether they want to spray it or drench? How often do you rotate? You mentioned like some of the long weeks of coverage, but how do you really know like how often to rotate? And then is there a way to determine whether that pressure or risk of resistance is actually going down over the season, or is that just hard to sort of quantify? I just asked you a lot of questions there. Take them however you want.
I'm like, my mind is spinning. I don't know where to start. So I guess we'll start with take one step back, and, these 3 products work great as a core rotation. The first thing, going back to what we were talking about, is sanitation. You will always use less pesticide if you start off clean. So you want to start as clean as possible. You had mentioned poinsettias. Sarah Jandricek, always butchered the last name, my apologies, at Omafra, really did some excellent research showing the use of dips to prevent the introduction of, not just thrips, but mites and other pests. Hugely important step there. So to keep your population levels down. If you do that, you can use less pesticide. You could also then use your treatments prophylactically and in a preventative way. And that's always, you're going to get much better control and much better results and much better protection instead of waiting for the problem to erupt I don't know, particularly with thrips in recent years, whether it's chili thrips or parvis spinus, I don't know a grower who's ever gotten from behind that 8 ball once the population has blown up. So that's really important. Early on, you can start, when we're talking about something like thrips and starting clean, there is using the dips that Sarah had recommended, but also a product to start clean, not ours, would be something like Hachi Hachi for thrips, really good knockdown, and then following up. And again, there's no one product that's going to give you that absolute control, and you have to do a rotation. Following up then with Contos, because as those buds start to develop, whether we're talking about bedding plants or just keeping your poinsettias not just clean from sucking pests, but also from mites, and Lewis mites have been a problem in recent years, going to Contos. And then also scouting to see what your problem is. You don't need to treat if you don't have a problem.
Right.
But at the same time, you want to make sure that you're scouting really well. I can't say enough about, the use of hand lenses. Really, anyone who knows me knows I always have my little hand lens. It's either in my purse or around my neck. And it's really important to see what's going on, particularly as you get older, because not even the readers help anymore. And making sure, especially with like poinsettias, because, the latex can fake you out, making sure that you don't have aphids or other, white flies or thrips. And then as far as the time limit, it comes to pressures. If you've been on top of things, you can get into more of a calendar. Where if the pressures are low, you could stretch things out to 3 to 4 or maybe even 5 weeks in the case of Altus. If the pressures are tighter or your scouting wasn't as good, or maybe your greenhouse is next to an alfalfa field or a cucurbit field or melon field, and the aphids are coming in. When you know that harvest date is, you want to make sure you have something on there to prevent them from establishing and getting into your greenhouse. Let's be really clear, having that 50 mesh screen to try and keep everything out is really great. But we all know these guys are small.
Right.
In case of aphids, they're coming in, pregnant with their grandchildren. And thrips, super, super small. It's easy for them to get in. So just staying on top and rotating, I think, are the most important.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And then the crazy question that I just added in there, like how do we as an industry know if resistance pressure or resistance is actually being reduced? Like how do we know that these steps that we're taking, and everybody is really trying to follow the rules and do the rotations? How do we know that that's working? Or is that something that you see that an entomologist sees, far later down the road?
Oh, that's a great question. And well, I would say that if you're having control, it's working. And I know, like in periods of time, going back in the day, when Conserve first came out, it was a game changer for thrips control. And then, I don't even know how many years ago people were saying, well, it's not working anymore. And everybody kind of backed away from it. But in my experience, at least, it has been a very important tool. It's, also a very pollinator friendly tool to bring back in there. So I think using your observations, but also going back and making sure, did I calibrate this correctly? Did I spray this properly? Especially with a product like Conserve, one of the best suggestions I got from a grower was they like to go out with Captiva Prime, which is it's pepper spray. It irritates everybody, including the thrips who come out of the buds. And then you hit it with a contact like, whether it's Hachi Hachi or Conserve, and it really knocks them down. And if you don't put that Captiva Prime in there, the thrips aren't going to come out of the buds, and you're not going to actually get the product in there enough to kill it. So that's why using these kind of integrative approaches are really important. But, if you do all of that and you're not getting good control, then maybe this isn't the year. And so when you go back to do the next application, oh my gosh, keep notes. There is no way you can keep all of that in your head. There are too many moving parts for all of these growers, and keeping notes is really important, and say, okay, we had this failure. We didn't have the control we expected. I've double checked the calibration was right. The nozzle was right. Everything seemed to be correct, but we aren't getting the control. Stupid is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome. Maybe for the rest of that season, pull the Conserve back. Next year, it's not going to go bad if it sits on the shelf for a year. And that's true for any product. and then follow up with it. Going back, one of the things that we were talking about thrips, one of the reasons I think Contos is such a great product is, it gets in the bud anyway and can really knock out those thrips larvae. So I think that's an important tool for doing that. Same with Altus, not so much in the bud and Aria, but they're also a nice integrated program. None of them are solutions. Conserve isn't anymore either. There are no silver bullets. And I think the sooner growers recognize that, along with using sachets of natural enemies to control their thrips, particularly, and keep in mind, I'll ask growers, they're like, well, I'm having a thrips problem. It's like, well, is it chili thrips? Is it parvospinus, or is it western flower thrips? They're like, well, it's thrips. And it's like, well,
they're very different.
They're very different. And how they respond to different insecticides is very different. That would be like expecting, your Chihuahua to respond the same way as a fox and the same way. I mean, they're all canines, but they're very different. And these thrips, like I was just looking at some chili thrips last week, 2 weeks ago, at a facility. And I was just struck, and I had chili thrips and western flower thrips in the same plant. And I was just struck at how much smaller the chili thrips are. I mean, they're just little munchkins compared to, you got Shaq here for your western flower thrips, and then you have Janna here for your chili thrips. I mean, these are obviously we're the same species, but these are very different sizes. So even then, like, the dose can also be one of the issues and why we're seeing differences. It's, going back, pull out your hand lens. I was like so impressed by the DSR I was traveling with. A shout out to you, Graham, if you're listening, because he was there with his hand lens, really trying to get a handle on what thrips were going on. So.
Yeah, no, I think that's all great advice. Yeah. Your point about keeping notes, like, there's no excuse anymore. Like, there's a million of notes sharing apps. Like, you can take the notes on your phone. You can have them shareable for your entire team. You can write them down and transcribe them. Like, we need to be keeping much better notes and right on the production plans, because that's really, I think, the best way to track the effectiveness of the different products that you're putting down year after year to make sure that you're getting the control that you need. I think that's really good advice.
That was one of the things with some of the bigger greenhouse operations that they have things set up. So like you're scanning a QR code and you can enter the notes right there. So exactly to what you're saying. For smaller operations, that might not be in your wheelhouse, but there's nothing to say that, go the clipboard route and stick it in a plastic sleeve so it doesn't get wet. So somebody can just quickly, or, a whiteboard or something that you can just jot down what you used. You aren't sitting there scratching your head going, what happened? Why do I have this problem?
It's true. And I see a lot of small greenhouses just using Google Docs, like just shareable. Everybody has access to it. It's free and it's there forever. And you can really do nice things manipulating those files on the back end. So
absolutely,
no excuse. Don't take, you got to take notes, know what you're doing year to year, and don't. This shouldn't be a secret when the new grower enters your greenhouse next year.
Absolutely.
Well, Janna, this has been an awesome discussion about a really important topic. I'm sure that the listeners will agree that you shared this critical information about resistance management, but also some really tactical solutions to put into the mix and into the toolbox immediately. So can you let the listeners know where they can find more information about the products we discussed and some of Envu's other solutions for greenhouse and nursery growers? And then what's the best way to connect with you and the team at Envu?
Yeah, so the best way would be to contact your area sales managers or to contact us directly. And we'd be happy to provide you with the information. My information is all of our first name dot last name at envu.com.
Perfect.
So an absolute shout out to my team of amazing professionals, Bob Froelich, Steve Larson, Brian McCaffrey, and Edgar Tina.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for doing that. I will put links because I know I can find a lot of the information on the website. I'll put links into the show notes for the listeners. I'll pull links for the 3 products, Altus, Aria, and Contos that we discussed as well. But like Janna said, your best bets, reach out to the team. They're all pros. They've been doing this a long time and they're really, really good experts and will help tailor make these programs for each greenhouse because, as you mentioned any number of times, it's different products for different pests and different diseases and different climates and regions, greenhouse configurations, crops, indoor, outdoor. Are you next to an alfalfa field? Like, there's so many nuances that you and the team can dig
We
into.
didn't even talk about phytotoxicity. So that's like
Right.
a really important, because some of the products that I named, they don't play nice with some plants. So we want to make sure that we have the right host, we have the right pest, and to give you the best options available to you.
Yeah. And like you mentioned calibration earlier, I was just talking to our technical team on Monday, and we were looking at some pictures of phyto, and it was just a calibration issue, and just burned up a crop. And I forget what the number was, but there was an extra zero added to the application of something, and it was not pretty. Yeah. Phyto should be a different discussion for a different day. Maybe we'll talk about phyto one day. But again, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. Like I said, I'm sure we're going to talk again. The listeners will see more from you and your entire team in future issues of Grower Talks, maybe even some webinars. But as always, I really appreciate your knowledge and experience, how you explain these issues, and then share the actionable steps for growers. Janna, thanks again, and take care.
Thank you. Have a great one, Bill.
And so on behalf of Janna and the entire Envu team, I'm Bill Calkins with Tech on Demand, wishing you a fantastic season and increased attention to the threat of resistance. Take care out there.